Okay, so we're delighted to see so many of you today. We have participants here from over 10 countries, spanning time zones, I think from about 7 in the morning, maybe it was a bit earlier for some, right through, well, I thought till midnight, but actually we have some Australian participants, and I think it's 2 o'clock in the morning. So huge thanks to all of you for taking part in this first webinar. We have a very mixed audience. A third of you are academics and not bridge players. Another third of you are bridge players and not academics, and the final third are both bridge players and academics. And this really reflects then BAMSA's aim to bridge the two worlds of academia and the global bridge community. I have to warn you that today this first webinar has quite an academic focus. So at times there's going to be theoretical and conceptual discussions, but we do anticipate that these will still be of interest to bridge players as well as academics. The webinar is linked to the research project Bridge and MindSport for All, and that's a project about the sociology of mind sport based at the University of Stirling. And on today's panel, you'll meet most of our current BAMSA team. Miriam, Jordan and Zoe are all sociologists who don't play bridge, whilst Christina and I are bridge players. And we find that this combination of outsiders and insiders works really well within our team. So this webinar is part of a BAMSA programme of online events this year. It's our first one, so we're hoping not to have too many hiccups with technology, but we are all part of a strange new world where the digital is playing a central role. And this has opened up many new opportunities as well as challenges for all of us, whether we're academics or bridge players. But BAMSA's key aim then is to do research to cover a range of bridge topics, and then we hope to work with bridge organisations in the future to use those research findings to raise awareness of the potential benefits of mind sports. Do please tweet and share on social media. We're keen to spread the word about both the research and the events. And if you do have any feedback from the webinar today or about, in fact, our new website, do email us. We're really keen to get feedback and to improve what we do. I am sharing this now because I don't want to have to share my slides again at the end of the day. So normally I probably would mention this at the end, but I thought it was just easier while I had my slides up to do it now. The next BAMSA event after this one, I know we haven't had this one yet, but the next one will be a 4-day conference at the end of June. We have 10 sessions planned. There'll be 2 hours each, and we do hope that some of you will register for those. We only have 90 minutes today, so we anticipate that we will be picking up on some of the issues raised today at the June conference. And in the conference in June, the first day, we'll be looking at bridges and mind sport. And again, that will be fairly academic focused. But the other 3 days will all very much be bridging these two worlds between academia and then bridge policy and practice. So on day 2, we will be looking at the impacts of a global pandemic on bridge and the rise of digital bridge. On day 3, we'll be looking at age, gender and intergenerationality. And the final day of the conference will look at development and education, in particular how to promote bridge as both a mind sport and a leisure activity. We're also looking forward today to the participation of the BAMSA Research Associates and the BAMSA Steering Group. Many of those are with us today, but they will also be presenting their work at this conference in June. And that includes those who are also doing research on bridge, Marek from Poland, Tihana from Croatia, Akiko from Japan, and Jose Julio from Madeira. So now I've introduced this first BAMSA event, I have great pleasure in introducing Professor David Scott from Recreation, Park and Tourism Services at Texas A&M University. I'm just going to stop sharing my slides to let him bring up his whilst I do finish an introduction. So that's me finished sharing, is that right? So Professor David Scott conducted his PhD fieldwork in US bridge clubs at the end of the 1980s, so over 30 years ago now. But his work has provided a very in-depth exploration of the social worlds of bridge. And this is invaluable work because until very recently, it was the only bridge research in the social sciences. So for both BAMSA and the other bridge researchers that I mentioned, his work has been extremely influential and is still very relevant, as we'll see today in this webinar. Since his PhD, David has had a long-standing interest in leisure social worlds with a focus on serious leisure, recreation specialization, leisure constraints, and non-participation. More recently, he has researched the use of urban parks and human dimensions of wildlife watching. Many of us here have engaged with his work, and we're really looking forward to hearing his talk. So over to you, Professor Scott, to reflect on the ways in which bridge research has helped shape 3 decades of your work in leisure studies.
Well, thank you so much, Sam, for that wonderful welcome. And I told Sam and her colleagues I was feeling much loved. It's been a while since anybody has actually actively spoken with me about my bridge research. I conducted this study over 30 years ago now, which is just remarkable, but it's been integral to some of the other things that I've studied. So just getting into how and what I learned, I need to really start with this disclaimer. I didn't go into this with the idea that I was going to study bridge. Back in the 1980s, when I started my doctoral work at Penn State, I was an active basketball player, a pickup basketball player, and my inspiration for studying bridge players really stemmed from that. I played regularly at noon, at least 3 times a week, and I could pretty well predict who was going to be there. There were no officers, there were no flyers. We came and played regularly. And I became fascinated at the time about how playgroups like this were able to sustain themselves over time. If you're wondering who I am in that picture, I am the big goof there wearing the shirt and the weird glasses. So my study of bridge was really consistent, or my interest in basketball at the time was really consistent with my interest in different slices of life. I've always been fascinated with what at the time I used to call leisure subcultures. I guess I was a bit of a voyeur. I was just interested in these slices of life and what drew people to these types of things. But I was a study of leisure. I took my studies very, very seriously, and I was interested in the sociology and social psychology of leisure. And I knew intuitively that leisure provided important benefits to people and meaning. You don't have to go much further than a chorus line. And if you're familiar with it, there was a character, Sheila, who somberly described in song her hellish hell life. But then she sang about what ballet meant to her, and she says, everything was beautiful at the ballet. So leisure could provide order for people amidst chaos. Going back even further, I was fortunate to have been assigned this reading during my doctoral work, Homo Ludens by the Dutch historian Hosan Huizinga. And he argued that leisure or play was fundamental to the formation of culture. And he argued that play promoted the formation of playgroups. So I understood that leisure would bring people together. And of course, this article by Smith, a Brit, brought that point home really nicely. And he documented that these regulars to this British pub fostered community. It helped provide community. And Smith described the pub as, quote, an oasis of certainty for regulars in what he called a hostile and external world. So I was keenly interested in how playgroups fostered community and how these groups sustained themselves over time. So this next slide really shows you a snapshot of some of the works or books or ideas that inspired me to actually study bridge players. the two of the books here, Amateurs and Conflict in the Great Outdoors, really provided me an idea that there were some people who actually devoted themselves to leisure pastimes. They were highly committed to the pastimes, and it became a central life interest. For those of you who with an academic bent, you might be more familiar with Stebbins, but at the time when I was doing my dissertation, his ideas about serious leisure were rather incipient. Much more influential was Hobson Bryan's work, who really looked at participants along a continuum of involvement from casual to serious. But I frame my study within the context of symbolic interaction. So ideas by Bloomer and Fine really helped me understand how these groups were not only units of social organization, but they were people actively creating culture and so trying to sustain themselves over time. And this led me to focus on these play groups as social worlds. And Unruh defined these social worlds as amorphous collection of actors, organizations, events, and practices that have coalesced into spheres of interest, or what I would call culture areas. So I likened play groups to these social worlds, and I understood that players were going to be linked to each other, not only in the context of these groups, but perhaps through other groups, or more vertically through different organizations. And so I knew that these social worlds were highly diverse. They were segmented or differentiated. And so if I was to study bicycling, I would have to understand the various subworlds of bicycling. Not all bicyclists are the same. And the same is true for climbing. The same would be true for basketball. So one of the things going into this study was I knew that people were going to vary in terms of their commitment. So this particular diagram gives you an idea of this continuum of involvement, and people can be classified in terms of low commitment or very, very high commitment. So those people on the low end tend to be occasional, casual players, maybe even tourists. Highly committed people are going to be the insiders. They're going to be the people who are going to be organizing involvement for others. Again, Stebbins' ideas were incipient, and I was much more relying on Bryan at the time. But why study bridge? Well, the easy answer is it was visible and it was accessible. I wanted to study a variety of adult playgroups. That was key to this. And I was a little too close to basketball. Some of the competitiveness would come out at times, and I realized that was probably not the best place for me. So when I was studying bridge, I knew about bridge. I mean, you've got Charles Gorin here, who appeared on Sports Illustrated 6 times. He appears as the king of hearts in Time magazine. So bridge was part of the American culture at the time, and I knew people who were playing bridge. And I had older siblings who played bridge. I knew people talked about, oh yeah, we used to play bridge all the time in college. And so when I was putting together my doctoral proposal, I decided to study bridge because I knew that there were lots and lots of groups out there that I could study. So I had a couple of guiding research questions as I went into this. And it's not important that I read all of this, but on the one hand, I wanted to understand the groups or play groups as social worlds. So I was understanding the group foundations and dynamics of these bridge groups. So I was interested in the various segments within the bridge groups, and how these things arose, how they were related to patterns of activity, and what the basis of activity legitimacy was. And I was also interested in the individuals themselves. And again, I'm relying quite a bit on Bryan's ideas about recreation specialization here. So who were these people, and what indicators were useful in differentiating them along a continuum of involvement? So, and I was also interested in whether or not these people could be sequentially organized as stages along a continuum of involvement. So much of the prior research up to this time had assumed that people would actually progress the longer they participated in this activity. Just a word really on methodology. My study was in ethnography. I was in the field for a year. So I found 4 groups of bridge players that allowed me to be a participant observer. I was a kibitzer, I was a player. I watched people as they played. And I watched probably over about a 6-month period. I also interviewed close to 40 people who were part of these groups. I also read as many documents as I could. I read bridge magazines, and so it was the early stages of the internet. So there was this thing called net news. It was a bulletin board about bridge players. So I really became engrossed in the social world. I was fascinated by bridge, and at the time I really enjoyed playing the game. So let me get into some of the major findings that I was able to glean from this. And one of the first things I discovered was, yeah, indeed, the social world was differentiated. And the primary source of differentiation was the sociability versus seriousness of the game. It's important to note that these were native terms by the bridge players. Early on, people would say, oh, we play serious bridge. We do not play social bridge. The social players would say, oh, we don't play serious bridge. They're too cutthroat. We play social bridge. This became reinforced over and over and over again. So this helped me create a typology of bridge groups that allowed me to differentiate these groups in terms of various patterns of activity. So things like recruitment processes, types of conversation, and their overall function. Another major finding or paper that I was able to get out of the study was based on really the ideas about specialization. So I was able to identify 4 major types of players, and they could be fitted loosely along a continuum of involvement. So I created a typology of players based on, or that reflected different styles of involvement. And one of the important things I was able to learn from this, and that's carried over with me the rest of my career, is these players don't necessarily progress to higher stages of involvement the longer they participate. Many individuals are willing to participate at what we might call a lower stage of involvement for their entire life and be content with that. By the way, I did identify occasional participants, and that's the category of participation I would describe myself at the present time, and I can go into that later on if you wish. Okay, stop for a second. These are snapshots of people playing bridge, and in many ways, these people looked an awful lot like the people that I studied. Regrettably, I did not take photos back in 1989 or 1990 of the people that I study. I wish I had. But many of these people at the time were elderly, older than I was. It didn't really occur to me that they were elderly until many of them just kept telling me, boy, you're young to be a bridge player. Really. One of the things that I found fascinating at the time, it was problematic, was that many of these groups did not meet as often as they said they did. Now, how am I going to collect data if they're not meeting? And it was a classic case, if you're an ethnographer, of not being able to see the forest for the trees. And I realized at the time that I was not only studying bridge players, but I was studying a pastime that consisted primarily of older adults and a game that was aging every day. And this led me to write about the decline of bridge in the United States. And it has waned markedly over the last 70 years. And as other pastimes have taken hold, because of various changes in society, popularity of bridge in the United States has waned markedly. This quotation from a college student, I was teaching a sociology class while I was pursuing my doctorate work, really gets at some of the images that young people at the time had of bridge players. What comes to mind when I think of bridge players? The older generation. My grandmother always asked me, don't you kids ever play bridge? To me, it's a game for older people. I mostly picture little blue-haired ladies playing. My current college students, most of them don't even know what bridge is. They don't know that it's a card game. Following up on this, I decided to actually start studying constraints related to bridge, but I wanted to study it from the point of view of bridge groups. I didn't want, most studies on constraints, even to this day, focus on from the point of view of the individual. I wanted to understand how constraints arose within the context of these groups. And just as an example, just being a member of a group can facilitate participation. And if you're not a member, that's going to constrain your participation. So if you're not a member, and if you can't find a partner in a tournament setting, you're likely not to participate very often. So I was interested in how dynamics of these groups created problems for individuals. Last study that I've written about bridge was only about 5 years ago with a former student of mine. And I wanted to develop this idea about a postmortem. And those of you who are into bridge probably recognize this term. It's a native term here in the United States. It's where people talk about their bridge hands after the game. And many of the serious players would go to clubs or bars or wherever and talk about the games. Or maybe they would get on the telephone. Maybe they get on the internet and they would dissect hands. And one of the things I learned is these postmortems really provided meaning for these people. It provided them continuity over time, helped them become better players, and it provided a way that they could bond with other players. Because in some of these tournament games or social or serious games, interaction tends to be frowned on. And so these postmortems provided a way for our players to bond, have fun, and cement their relationships with other people. So some final thoughts, and some of these are based on my bridge study, but some of these are things that I've gleaned with some of my students or in my own studies since then. I think leisure scholars often ignore what Meyerson called the connectedness of humans. So much of North American leisure focuses on the individual, and we don't study people in the context of groups that they pursue pastimes with. And that's how I focus my bridge study. And I would argue that that indictment is still true today among North American scholars. I think it's very unwise to assume participants, bridge players and others, naturally progress over time. I think one of the great challenges we all face in our leisure is finding people who like to do things at our pace. And we're all striving for community. And frequently, if we can find people who like to do things the way we do it, we're going to continue to do things that way. And so people aren't necessarily going to progress. One of the things I've learned but become much more aware of in my career is that leisure social worlds are highly racialized and gendered. I didn't focus on this very much in my bridge study. I would argue that I should have, but that's for you folks to do. And the main thing I guess I learned from bridge, and the thing that's carried over with me for the last 30 years, is social world members coalesce on the meaning they ascribe to activity. So it's not just social, it's not serious, it's what the activity means to people. And so that to me is a defining characteristic of what it means to be involved in a social world. So I'm going to stop there. I got to tell you guys, I am thrilled to be with you all. I'm feeling much loved. It's wonderful to see my articles be resurrected. That one article about the death of bridge or the decline of bridge, it actually was published in a journal that died shortly after it was published. I don't know if there was a coincidence, but I'm hoping that you folks can give that article a little bit more traction than it's gotten today. So thank you very much. And I'll see if I can't stop sharing here.
Thank you, David. That was fascinating. An excellent introduction to a wider discussion today. So we're now going to see, are there any specific questions that anybody would like to pose to David in response to that before we go into the panel? In the panel, we will be discussing those 4 papers that he mentioned from the 1990s, but is there anything else people would like to ask before we do that? I don't think we've had any questions coming in so far, so yeah, we can make, we'll make this recording and we'll make the slides available on our website afterwards. So, yeah. Christina?
Yes, I have a question for David, which relates to the Heisinger you mentioned, the Homo ludens.
Yep.
Because he dedicates a couple of pages to bridge.
Yes, he does.
Which he deems to be the antithesis of play. It's about as earnest as he can imagine, earnestness being the opposite to playfulness. And I wondered if you had any reflections on that perspective.
Well, certainly some forms of bridge can be highly serious, and I think he gives short shrift to the idea that some forms of play can become highly serious to people and important to people. And I saw one comment that some people, the idea was that even social groups can be serious, and yeah, in a way, people do take the participation very, very seriously. But I think Huizinga did give short shrift to the idea that these bridge groups can vary in sociability and seriousness. And even those people who are serious still find the activity fun. It isn't something that they are going to die over. I think Huizinga gave short shrift to the idea that, you know, fun was inherent even in these serious bridge clubs.
Yeah, I think there's been quite a lot of comments in the chat suggesting that there's a lot of overlap between social and serious. But I think, as somebody's pointed out, whilst players may do both, they can't do both necessarily at the same time. So they may have social games with certain partners and then serious games with different partners, rather than combining social and serious with the same bridge partner. So it's quite interesting comments coming through. Do keep putting in your comments and questions, but we've now, given we haven't had other questions yet in the chat, we will continue with the panel. Each of the panel will be taking one of the papers and discussing it from the 1990s, and we will have the panel presentations all together, and questions will be raised, and then we'll give David a chance to respond to those after all the panels have presented. But as I say, do please keep putting in your questions that we'll accumulate for the final discussion with everyone. So first up then is Miriam. Dr. Miriam Snellgrove is going to talk about the 1991 paper, The Problematic Nature of Participation in Contract Bridge, a qualitative study of group-related constraints. So over to you, Miriam. You'll need to unmute.
Hi. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So I'm going to just give a little bit of an overview, and I'm going to talk about the ways in which this article specifically links to some of the things that we've been doing in BAMSA and some projects that we've had, and then finish with a question for David. So just to start off, for those of you who haven't read the article, David engages in a year-long qualitative ethnographic study of bridge clubs in Glen Valley, the pseudonym he gives to a town with a number of bridge clubs. And he uses bridge as a case study to explore the nature of constraint in leisure studies. At the time of writing, as David has touched on, understandings of constraint tended to focus on individual, as in more psychological explanations around leisure uptake. And David is trying very much to take a much more sociological and in particular a symbolic interactionist approach to understanding constraint. David argues that constraint in relation to bridge can be understood in the following 3 ways. 1, the aging complexion of bridge players. 2, group processes and interpersonal constraints. And 3, irreconcilable differences among individuals. In so doing, David shows, as he says, the interconnectedness of human activity. So I will briefly highlight key points from the 3 sections that continue to have ongoing relevance to the bridge world and our research today. So point number 1, when he talks about aging, David points out that bridge is facing a problem in uptake from younger players. He explains this is partly due to increased leisure opportunities available post-World War II, and the problem of finding 3 other players for the game, in contrast to other solo leisure pursuits. His participants memorably state, bridge here is dying a slow and painful death, and folks are dying, resulting in declining bridge tables at clubs. The problem of ageist images around bridge is also mentioned. This is even more relevant today with declining uptake in the bridge world in the global north, though you could argue perhaps that there's other things happening in China, and the keen focus by national and international bridge organizations on teaching children bridge and getting bridge into schools. In our most recent project that we started during the first national lockdown last year, we did a call out asking people to send diary data telling us how their bridging lives had been affected due to the lockdowns that had occurred globally. And we had an overwhelming response, but the majority participant base was over 70 plus. So I think that lets you know something of the nature of who is playing bridge and also who is responding to our research call. So the aging issue that David points out definitely is still a pressing and important one. His second point about group processes and interpersonal constraints. He suggests here that a connected constraint can be seen in the ways in which bridge clubs operate. To participate and know about a local bridge club demands knowledge of the bridge world already. Accessing a club can be difficult, and when a club has been accessed, problems can arise with behavior at the tables, with players being aggressive and unpleasant when mistakes are made, and unfavorable distinctions being drawn between club and social bridge players. Issues around mistakes at the table and the problems that can arise from this is something that we, Sam and I, have recently developed and explored in our paper, Playing Your Life, Managing Impressions and Strategic Interaction in the Game of Bridge. There, like with David, we use symbolic interactionist theories to show how elite bridge players advocated a form of supportive silence when mistakes were made, as getting cross with your partner only served to benefit the opposing partnership and, crucially, demoralized your partner. This was not always achieved, but something to continually work on and develop. Finally, point 3, irreconcilable differences amongst individuals. Building on his previous 2 arguments, David shows how club bridge results in a series of constraints that further hinder the playing of the game. Chiefly, these are the differences between club and social players. Players who want to develop and progress in their game are often constrained by the ability of other players in their club who don't take the game seriously enough. Simultaneously, social bridge players come for the chat and interaction and don't necessarily want a serious game. These distinctions between social and serious bridge players have become evident in the analysing of our COVID data from the project I just mentioned earlier. Due to the massive move online, precipitated by various national lockdowns globally, many players have enjoyed the ability to be able to play with other bridge players internationally from different clubs, bypassing geographical constraints and locations, and equally being able to watch and learn from the pros. So the online has been a huge benefit for many players. However, in our data, there are also a significant number of players for whom the move online, whilst enabling them to continue to play bridge, mourn and long for a return to club bridge and the social interactions at the table. For them, bridge is not about developing technique, but the friendships formed and everyday interactions that are important. In conclusion, David highlights how a series of intrapersonal, interpersonal, and structural constraints hinder the take-up and maintaining of contract bridge as a leisure activity. He calls for future research to explain constraints that both encourage and constrain participation. So thank you very much for your paper, David. Despite being 30 years old, I was just talking about this with another BAMSA member. I was 11 when this paper was published. It clearly shows how the concerns and issues raised then are still relevant today, some of which I have mentioned. And as I said earlier, we've used in symbolic interactionist theories as well to challenge more individualist conceptions of leisure. However, arguably, I would say the most significant change and difference between then and now, and one you could hardly have anticipated, has been the arrival of the pandemic and the ways in which COVID and the attendant national lockdowns has affected social, club and tournament bridge. With online bridge booming and many people playing now more than ever before, as well as being able to play with people from across the globe, from different clubs, and also to watch professional bridge players play, I wanted to end by asking you this. How and in what ways do you think digital bridge can be conceptualized as different from traditional face-to-face bridge? Thank you.
Thanks, Miriam. We're going to move straight on to Jordan. And David, you can collect the questions and decide which ones you want to focus on. There's also other questions coming into the chat that you might like to look at. So now it's Jordan McLean, another of the BAMSA team, who's going to be looking at the 1992 paper, an analysis of adult play groups, social versus serious participation in contract bridge. So both of these first two papers were published in Leisure Sciences.
Hello everyone, I'm just uploading my slides. They should be with you very shortly.
Great, we can see them.
Okay, yeah. So I would just like to first of all thank Professor David Scott for his wonderful presentation on bridge. It was absolutely fascinating to hear how the studies have been developed and taken forward into reflecting on the BAMSA team's research. I'm currently a research assistant for the BAMSA team. I've just started in January. I'm very excited to be discussing David Scott's and Jeffrey Godby's 1992 paper, an analysis of adult playgroups, social versus serious participation in contract bridge. Two bridge worlds. So Scott and Godby's paper intriguingly presents bridge as existing in two worlds, serious and social bridge. The depiction of bridge as two worlds is inspired from an interactionist theoretical lens of a social world perspective. The methodology is ethnographic from a year-long observation and interviews with bridge players in 5 bridge clubs. The differences between the serious and social bridge worlds is exemplified in Table 1 within the paper. And there are several components of these interactionist differences, including recruitment, function, gameplay, setting, management, rules, sequencing of activity, topics of conversation, stakes, partnership formation, club members, interpersonal relationships, and substitutes. In the world of social bridge, players are invited by special invitation with friends in a relaxed atmosphere involving food, drinks, and chatter, usually in a player's home. Rubber or party bridge is played with partners who are randomly assigned or through member substitutes, and gameplay loosely follows the rules. Social bridge is horizontally structured and tends to be legitimated by women. In the world of serious bridge, however, membership is based on skill. Partnerships or partner substitutes are assigned in advance. Those good enough can test out their bridge skills in regulated competitions held in bridge clubs with other similarly skilled players. This makes for an intense atmosphere where the stakes are high for players who desire to become life masters as opposed to hopeless players. Strict rule following always occurs, followed by post-mortems for analysing performances. Serious bridge is vertically structured and tends to be legitimated by men. So I've developed 4 questions for Professor David Scott, and the first one stems from the BAMSA team's interest and inspiration from the 2 ideal types of player identified in your paper, Professor Scott. One of our projects is committed to developing a marketing strategy for promoting bridge to the widest possible audience. Since the publication of your paper, Do you foresee any other types of bridge players? And if so, in what ways are they differentiated? Secondly, in your study, you noted that the bridge community consists of a primarily aging population of players. Is the age of players in your study generalizable or more diversified to bridge players in clubs today? Thirdly, you mentioned you were split between a researcher role as a participant observer and a player role as a kibitzer. Which category do these roles fit within the two worlds that you presented? Could this warrant a third world? And finally, a prominent trend in the sports management literature is a similar dichotomy between amateurism and professionalism. Is the amateur-professional dichotomy consistent with your conceptualization of bridge as two worlds? Thank you very much. I'll pass back to Professor Samantha Punch. Lead on to the next speaker.
Thanks, Jordan. Next up is Zoe Russell, and Zoe's going to be talking about the 1994 paper, Scott and Godby, Recreation Specialization in the Social World of Contract Bridge, and this was published in the Journal of Leisure Research. Thanks, Zoe.
Thank you, Sam, and thanks, David, for your paper. So this is the 1994 paper, and it leads quite nicely on from the paper that Jordan has just discussed. So this paper brings recreation specialization, which was mostly used in relation to outdoor environments and activities, to the world of contract bridge. So the idea of recreation specialization invokes ideas of diversity among the participants of a given activity and different styles of involvement. So there's a specialization continuum which exists in activities ranging from high to low. David's paper cautions, though, that specialization is not simply where one progresses along a continuum, becoming increasingly specialized over time, and the paper aims to make clearer the conditions under which people specialize in an activity. So when applying this to contract bridge, recreation specialization was used alongside the idea of social worlds, which we've heard about. And so in bridge, the idea of having the social and serious bridge worlds. So this paper asks, what types of players are there in the social worlds of bridge? What indicators are useful in differentiating among players? And are the types of bridge players sequentially organized as stages on a continuum? So the paper suggested a fourfold typology of groups of players, which represent ideal types. So we have tournament players, regular duplicate players, regular social players, and occasional players. Implicit in the study of recreation specialization is this sense of incremental progression from one end of the continuum to another over time. And so David suggested that this is not the case among the four types in the bridge world. Rather, these four types represent unique styles of involvement. And as we've heard, maybe few social players had aspirations to become serious players, for example. So the paper presents insights into each of the four categories and the ways that players self-identify within them. And so there's differences in these categories related to intensity of involvement, the meaning that players have around their own participation, the game setting and preferences, the frequency of play, the orientation to skill development, and the kind of commitment made, which is consistent with recreation specialization in previous studies, thus highlighting the value of applying the concept of recreation specialization to activities that are not outdoor related. The study finds that bridge players do not become more specialized over time because the four groups do not fit along a developmental sequence, and some players actively resist specialization. The paper suggests looking closely at the self-defining nature of recreation participation, which aligns well with the symbolic interactionist nature of this work, drawing on the likes of Becker and Bloomer. And so in our BAMSA work, this paper has been particularly useful for exploring ideas related to the social world of elite bridge. And we propose the elite as a new category that could be added onto the top of the tournament category. We've also examined ideas of specialization in relation to the motivations of elite players and in relation to the differentiation of amateur and professional categories within the elite social world. So some reflections on the paper and questions for David. Nearly 30 years on from the paper's initial publication, How then has the idea of recreation specialisation changed or stayed the same as described in the paper? I also find the idea of the non-linearity of recreation specialisation very interesting, and I wonder whether David might expand on this and also try and explore maybe the logic or reasoning behind why players would be within a particular type of category. So can we explain the differentiation of the 4 categories in a broader theoretical context? But the main question I had was really around the idea of self-definition, which comes through in the paper. Bridge is an example of an activity that is a dyadic form of leisure, so it's always played in partnership. So how does this partnership interaction have an impact on how we can understand recreation specialisation, perhaps, compared with individual pursuits? That's all I had, so thanks very much. And I will pass back over to Samantha Punch.
Great, thanks Zoe. I'm just going to get my slides up. Okay, are you seeing that? Can you nod, Zoe, if you can see that? Can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Just so I can check. Thank you. Okay, so the final paper from the 1990s that we're going to discuss is the narrative, a narrative analysis of a declining social world. And this is the paper that David hopes will get a bit more exposure. So we're starting to do that for you now, David. So this paper discusses the growth of bridge that focuses on the 1930s to the 1950s. And it gives several reasons for this growth: that it was cheap and fun home entertainment, that people learnt through their social networks, they learnt through family connections and within the neighbourhood, and it was at a time when cards was a very popular pastime. So at that time there were a lack of competing interests, it was fashionable, and it got a lot of publicity in newspapers. Here is a picture of Zia, who the bridge players here will recognise Zia because he's probably our most famous player, but he is only a celebrity in our bridge world. Back then, top bridge players were like minor celebrities in their own right, and they were both role models and promoters of the game in wider society. And back then, people also played more simple systems, so it was also easier to follow and understand if watching. And the decline then gradually began from the 1960s onwards. At that time, from the 1960s, there were more leisure choices that have become available, and many of these alternatives were quicker to learn than bridge. There were some key lifestyle changes, as, for example, work began to involve less manual labour, so hobbies became more physical to compensate for the lack of activity at work. More women were going out to work, so they had less time to play, especially during the day. And although bridge had been successful in newspapers, when television came into force, there wasn't much successful TV coverage. It is very hard to make bridge exciting for spectators to watch if they don't know how to play. You do need some knowledge in order to follow it well. And there's also some intergenerational tensions that this paper says partly explains why young people don't play in bridge clubs. And some of the other papers have already touched on this, that bridge clubs aren't always the most friendly of places for various reasons, and young people aren't always most welcome. And in turn, older people can feel threatened by younger people coming in and beating them, or coming in and playing more creative, innovative systems that older people find threatening or don't understand. So young people can feel restricted and not welcomed by older people, but it can also be reciprocal. And many of the papers have already touched on this, and David touched on this himself, that all of this feeds into the negative images which hinder the future growth of bridge. And this really speaks then to the ongoing work of BAMSA, because we're very interested in how we can tackle these stereotypical images of bridge as a dull game only for older people, when in practice all ages can play and all ages do play. The paper points to some theories of social change to explain this, and perhaps even though this was 30 years ago, perhaps some of these are still the case today, where time is scarce and life is lived at a fast pace. People have more limited concentration spans as they flip between activities or do several activities at once. And linked to this is the increased desire to own material goods. Perhaps cards are just too simple. Maybe cards aren't perceived as an exciting enough activity to spend time or money on. So alongside this commodification of leisure and increased time pressure, leisure's also become de-skilled. People lack patience for perseverance that's required to build up the skills to get good at bridge. People want something that's quick to learn and quick to do well. And in capitalist societies, where there's an emphasis on buying things and doing things quickly, bridge doesn't fit with that. It's cheap, but it takes time. So now I think, there was back then 30 years ago, but even more so today, there's a recognition that we need to be more proactive in terms of promoting bridge as a mind sport that can be enjoyed by all ages and all levels. And that bridge can actually offer an opportunity to slow down the pace of life, to be away from tablets and screens when you're playing face-to-face bridge, obviously not digital bridge in lockdown. And it's an opportunity to develop different skills through the cards and interaction at the bridge table. Bridge might not appeal to everyone, but we need to do a better job at reaching those that it might appeal to. So these were just some questions that occurred to me as I was reading the paper, but I don't think we're going to have time for all of these ones today. But these are kinds of questions that we will pick up again at the June conference. 30 years on, what has changed in terms of the ageing bridge population that David's papers describe? What's happening in other countries and what is being done to enable bridge to flourish? And the final question picks up on other papers by David too. What further research do we need to do to understand the contemporary nature of bridge as a leisure activity? And how might we promote it in new ways to make it attractive to younger players and to lessen the perceived and real intergenerational tensions that get played out in bridge environments? So I also have some more specific questions for you today, David. Those ones are ones that we may in the social world of bridge. And I think this relates to one of the questions that I've seen coming up in the chat is, do you perceive bridge as a sport, as a leisure activity? How would you describe it? You began your talk by comparing bridge and basketball, for example. Yeah. And finally, what do you see as the key similarities and differences between recreation specialization and the serious leisure perspective? As you said, back then, the serious leisure perspective wasn't really as fully developed as it is now. So now, where do you see those key similarities and differences? And this is just a reminder of the kind of key questions that the panel has mentioned, but we will cut and paste these key questions and put them into the chat for you, David, and you can decide which you want to tackle. Okay, so we will put those questions in the chat, and David, it's back to you to decide how you'd like to tackle all the questions that your papers from the 1990s have raised for bridge researchers today.
Well, can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great, great. Thank you guys for wonderful presentations. I wish my mom were alive so she could have seen that. She would have been really proud of me. And I tell my graduate students that all the time. You know, if you get accolades, tell your mom, tell your dad, they would have been thrilled. So, but thank you guys for that. It was just marvelous. And I probably can answer a question from each of you. Miriam, I really liked your question about whether or not digital bridge can be conceptualized as traditional face-to-face bridge. You know, this was not something that was on any of our radar 30 years ago. It was not there. And, you know, I applaud what you guys are doing. The American Contract Bridge League is starting to get this. I think you guys are ahead of the ACBL in terms of trying to teach younger people how to play bridge. In the United States, anyway, historically, it was something that maybe you learned from your parents. A lot of the times, people were socialized in college or through their peers. But we didn't have necessarily formal training. And I think that's what's going to have to happen if bridge is resuscitated. And what better way to do that through the internet and digital bridge? You know, young people today are on their phones, on their laptops, on the computer, almost 24/7. And so, you know, maybe the COVID-19, there is a silver lining in all of this. For example, we would not be perhaps having this type of educational format had it not been for COVID-19. So I think the digital format is something that will be very attractive to young people, and who knows, maybe they'll find it interesting enough that after COVID or in time, they'll say, you know, I think I'd like to do this face-to-face with people. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity there to expand interest and knowledge of bridge through digital formats. Again, this was not something that was on anybody's radar 30 years ago. Bridge players that I talked to or read about said, internet's going to be the death of us. I think you have an opportunity to make that statement false. Let's see. Jordan, I really appreciate the differentiation, the detail you went into talking about social bridge versus serious bridge. Are there gradations of seriousness that I missed? You know, I didn't see it when I did my bridge study. I think I look at other social worlds. I know that there are middle grounds. So much of what happened when I studied bridge either happened in people's homes or it happened in clubs that were sponsored by the American Contract Bridge League. And so that became a way of thinking about bridge for people. And I'm guessing there was a middle ground, but I didn't necessarily see it myself. I do know it exists in other areas. Parenthetically, I want to talk about, you know, is bridge a sport? You know, I don't want to reify what sport means. There are lots and lots of people who will talk about the fact that there has to be some physical element to it. I just don't want to go there. I do know that tournament bridge, elite bridge, is very sport-like. I mean, it takes an awful lot of skill development. You have to put time and effort to hone your craft. You know, the ideas by Stebbins have been very, very helpful in that regard. And he doesn't necessarily say, well, this is sport, this is non-sport. He calls it serious leisure. And serious leisure is very, very much bridge. It's very much like basketball and other activities. So I don't want to get into navel gazing and saying, well, is this a sport or not? I do know it is all the characteristics of serious leisure. And so it's much more like basketball, bicycling, football, soccer, rugby than other pastimes, particularly if you're pursuing it at an elite level. So you talked about how the partnership aspects of bridge affects dynamics in comparison to other types of leisure and how that plays out. Yeah, because of the group nature of bridge, that was integral to my study. You can't separate the partnership aspects out of it. You know, in elite bridge, in tournament bridge, people were turned away because they could not find regular partners. They were considered undesirable partners. People were making the same mistakes, and as much as they would have liked to have played bridge, they were not going to be able to play because elite players, tournament players, felt they were making the same mistakes over and over and over again. Similarly, if you were an abusive player, you were going to find that there were going to be fewer and fewer people who were going to tolerate the crapola that you were giving out day in and day out. And so they became what I call partner dependent. They had fewer and fewer people that were willing to play with them. But looking at social bridge, very, very different animal. You had to be able to get along. You know, of course, you had to be able to play bridge, but your skills at bridge were going to be secondary to whether or not you got along with your friends, whether you could host. Amiability was everything. So unlike a lot of other pastimes, partnership dependence was integral to bridge, and I don't think that you can shake that. And it's part of the social world, and it's neither bad nor good. It is what it is. And so unlike bird watching, bicycling, and other things, you don't have to be as dependent on partners to get along. Let me look at some of the other things. I took photos of these as you were going. Sam, you talked about differences between recreation specialization and serious leisure. Oh, goodness gracious. Opening a can of worms there. I've written extensively about this over the last 10 years. Bob Stebbins, who coined the term serious leisure, he's been a very close colleague of mine. He's been very, very helpful. He and I get along really well. I've taken him to task here and there. And, the big question I had, and I wrote a paper about this about 6-7 years ago, is, had Bob Stebbins and Hobson Bryan been in the same room in the 1970s, would they have used the term serious leisure, recreation specialization, whatever? And, academics get really possessive about their ideas. We're proprietary, and our academic livelihoods are sometimes dependent on having our ideas have currency. So those of you who are tuning in who are bridge players may find this kind of dull, like, oh, what's this all about? But, you guys have your own systems of bidding. And I'm guessing you guys probably are proprietary about your ways of bidding. And my sense is that the people who study specialization feel they've got a lot to lose by giving up that term specialization. And I know the people who study serious bridge are not going to call what they study specialization. My sense is we're studying the same phenomenon. We're using very, very different terms. And I think the people who study serious leisure can learn an awful lot by the things that we people who have studied specialization for decades. And if I were to say, is there a word or a cover term that better describes the phenomena, I would say it is in fact serious leisure. But I think many of the insights that we've learned from specialization have to be understood, have to be accepted by those people who are studying serious leisure. So that's a bit of a rabbit hole. Looking at the aging complexion of the game, well, I think it's gotten worse, at least in the United States. Bridge groups that I studied are not holding on; they are dead. Folded because of they could not bring new players into the fold. And as I noted, many of my students now, when I say contract bridge, maybe 5% of them know what that is. When I was studying the game 30 years ago, I would say 95% of them knew what contract bridge was. So the game is vanishing from our culture, and you're going to have to be very deliberate in terms of how you're going to resuscitate it. And one last point I would make is, I know many of you are vested in tournament bridge, what I would call serious bridge. And the vast number of bridge players, at least in the United States, were social players. And I think many of them want to play social bridge. So to the extent that you can meld the best of serious bridge and social bridge, think that's going to give you a chance in the future. And yeah, go digital.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. If you've got energy, we've got some more questions coming
Please.
in for you. So we had a question early on by Patrick Shields, who asked, is there any wisdom to offer on if, when and how people transition between the different subgroups that you've described?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I wish I had a silver bullet there. I would say that from a lot of my research over the last 30 years is that people's progression or lack thereof is because of various career contingencies. And sometimes it involves just being in the right place at the right time. And so, you know, going back in time, I know some of the social players became serious players because they could not find other social players. And then when they discovered serious bridge groups, they thought, wow, this is fantastic. I can play really, really good bridge here. So in some cases, it's just being introduced to that form of bridge. But, you know, in other cases, people find people like them, they're playing maybe social bridge, and they like playing social bridge. And some of these people that I studied had been playing in the same clubs for 40 or 50 years. They loved the people they were playing with. And you know, why in the world would they decide to become a serious player? They actively eschewed progression. They did not want to see or become a serious player. They described serious players as rude, cutthroat, serious. So those were not friendly terms to them. So I think progression will happen for some people, and getting people interested in bridge can happen, but it's going to have to be somewhat deliberate in terms of introducing people to the style of game. And when they see that style of game, some will be really turned on to it. Most won't, but some will.
Yeah,
I hope I answered that question in a satisfactory manner, because there are all kinds of career contingencies associated with progression. I call myself an occasional player. I became a father shortly after I did my dissertation. I discovered if I wanted to remain an academic, I actually had to act like one, like do research and write. And so I put on my back burner serious involvement in a whole range of pastimes. So those were career contingencies that really stopped my progression in anything besides work.
You know, I think a few of us here might be able to relate to that.
Yeah.
There's some other interesting questions coming in. Chris has asked to hear your thoughts on bridge and class. His experience in Sydney is that it's often played in more affluent areas with higher social economic status. Is this similar, do you think, around the world? And if so, why is this the case, and how can that be changed?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I think, well, let me back up. I told you that I consider myself now a social or an occasional player. When I got involved in bridge, like a couple of people on your team who are non-participants, I was a non-participant, really. I mean, I knew the rudiments of the game. I got into it with most cursory skill level. And by the time I got done with all of my research, I was gung-ho. That was a term that a lot of bridge players used. And I thought, well, this has just got to be the greatest game in the world. And I think the game has got a lot going for it. I think it's exciting. It's arousal seeking. I mean, it's fun. And I think that can transcend gender, race, ethnicity, income, age. So I don't think, though, that you're going to introduce it to, let's say, lower income population with the Bill Gates of the world. I mean, they're going to have role models that look like them. And so I'm an American, so some of my examples will probably be relevant to Americans. So I don't know if you guys know who Charles Barkley is, African-American basketball player. If he were introducing bridge to African-American youth, they'd say, yeah, Charles, we're on. So you're going to have to find people who resemble those populations if the game is going to thrive outside of some of the affluent communities. It's like anything else. I mean, we're going to want to play this pastime with people who look like us.
Yeah. And I mean, I think this relates to a question that's come in from Jose Julio Curado, who's doing a PhD on bridge and mind sports. His question is, do you think bridge could be used then as a way to promote a more inclusive, fair and cohesive society, and at the same time increase longevity and social well-being? So just a small little question for you there.
Yeah. Well, it's a question that I've thought about an awful lot. And I get at this a wee bit in the article where I distinguish between social bridge and serious bridge. And, you know, the social clubs are not particularly inclusive. I mean, those clubs are formed in order to cement friendships, in order to further the friendships. And it's a vehicle for celebrating, you know, friendships. And so bridge is just one of maybe potential many activities these people participate in. And oftentimes the people who participate in those clubs look an awful lot like those other people in the clubs. Serious clubs, on the other hand, can potentially be more inclusive. The groups that I studied, there was a much greater diversity of gender. There was diversity in terms of race and ethnicity. Some, I don't want to push it too far. And so I think people are willing to deem some of the outside statuses that might get in the way of a healthy friendship in the serious clubs as irrelevant, at least for the time being. And I think the serious involvement can potentially contribute to some of these interpersonal or interracial ethnic differences as irrelevant or like misguided. So I think it potentially can do that, but you're going to have to be very deliberate about it. And you're going to have leaders who believe, yeah, you know, bringing together these diverse people is really, really important. And they're going to have to at least set the example. Is it going to save, is it going to result in world peace? Well, let's take one bridge player at a time.
We have a kind of a related question from Heather Gibson. She says, the focus on the decline in social bridge is also reminiscent with Putnam's Bowling Alone and his focus on social capital, all published about the same time. Can we also integrate social capital in our analysis of social worlds? Since you did your initial work, we have certainly recognized the importance of social interaction as part of these social worlds. Our latest conceptualizations of enduring involvement also recognize the importance of the social. So the question is, can we integrate social capital into our analysis of social worlds?
Well, the simple answer is yes. Heather Gibson is the one other individual I actually know. She's a colleague of mine, unless there's a different Heather Gibson. She's at the University of Florida. So I think I know this Heather quite well. And I think the answer is yeah. I became familiar with Robert Putnam's work as I was writing articles. He had actually written an article, can't remember the journal it was, on Bowling Alone. And I sent him my article on the decline of bridge, one, Sam, that you actually presented. And he emailed me back and we exchanged conversations. And one of my claim to fames is that if you read the book Bowling Alone, I am the very first footnote in that book. So some people actually derive their fame from actually writing books. My claim to fame is a bloody footnote. But yeah, I think bridge groups actually do contribute to social capital. I mean, these groups are important to people. You learn about what's going on in the community. You learn about, okay, if you've got this knee problem, see this doctor. Oh, if your kid's having a problem in the community, maybe he or she should see this specialist. So these bridge groups connect people in ways that go beyond simply bridge. Bridge, of course, is very, very important. It's the thing that maybe initially binds us together, but we develop friendships and we develop connections that help us get on with our lives. And that's true in social bridge. It's true in serious bridge as well. So I recognize that social capital exists within these clubs. That said, it wasn't necessarily something that I was initially focused on, but I recognize it definitely is a byproduct of the bridge. So Heather, I really appreciate you asking that question, because then I could sneak that reference into Robert Putnam in the footnote.
We also have another question coming in from Roger Williams, who said that you said that clubs can act as gatekeepers and restrict membership, whilst online bridge means potentially a much wider participation is possible. And that's sort of related to an earlier question by Catherine. Catherine asked, does technology reduce the barrier for youth bridge? So yeah. I think you touched on some of this, but maybe you could say a bit more.
I think it absolutely can. And I think the digital world will certainly help bridge an awful lot. You don't often have to look at the people that you're playing with. I hope this is not a gross reference. You don't have to smell them. Some of these differences that seem important to us when we visit with people face to face can potentially disappear when you're playing bridge. I don't know how much community is developed through these online communities. I think the digital world has the potential for good and bad. I mean, we've seen it in the United States with the last 8 years and political elections. People get their information online, and it's sound bites, and so our world is divisive because of it. But I think it potentially opens you up to communities of interest that are maybe not accessible locally. Maybe you can find people like you beyond, let's say, where you live, and maybe you can develop community out of that. Now, that said, I mean, if we're talking about bridge played at not even an elite level, but people want to take the game at least seriously enough that, like, all right, we want to play good bridge here. Some of those players who are making the same mistakes over and over again may find themselves uninvited or unwelcome, even on online forums. So I think that, these online communities can potentially move beyond some of the gatekeeping mechanisms. But if we're talking about quality bridge, I think you'll find yourself not welcome if you're not learning. So that will always be there.
And I suppose one thing that we're seeing in the COVID-19 research in the digital bridge is that whilst I think the numbers vary, but whilst the numbers vary, it's approximately only about 50 to 60% that are playing online. So there's still a big marginalized proportion of players who are constrained by the online environment for a variety of reasons.
Do you know whether or not people are finding it enjoyable?
I think it's a bit like we have Marmite. I don't know if you have Marmite where you are, you either love it or hate it. So people do like it or dislike it. There is also now the new option of Real Bridge where you can see people. It combines Zoom with playing. And again, not everybody likes it because some people like to play in their pajamas.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So those differences still matter.
Yeah. We had an earlier question from Marek. He asked, how typical were the clubs that you did your research in for your PhD in the US, and how big was the city?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, the community, I think I can tell you now, of State College, Pennsylvania, I think there's the statutes of limitation have gone by the board. was a university town. The time, maybe 50,000 or so people. I would say the social groups were very, very typical. I mean, I participated in some social groups out of State College. The tournament clubs, the ones sponsored by the ACBL, I think were fairly typical. Now, that said, I did not necessarily attend a lot of tournaments. I attended one large tournament, a regional tournament. So most of the things that I was studying was very, very local. And so I did not necessarily study bridge players in New York City, Dallas, Houston, or shoot, little towns for that matter. But I would say this, you know, I was keenly aware of whether or not findings that I was getting or gleaning were applicable beyond my case study. And everything I read would indicate, yeah, it was. You know, people use the term serious, social. Ideas about the decline of bridge, those were applicable across the board. And so I recognize that there are limitations with the study I focused on and because of the area, but I also recognize that the more I read, the more I traveled, same type of things were being observed elsewhere.
Okay, that's great. I mean, as I said earlier, we haven't necessarily covered everybody's questions, but we've had a good smattering of them. We will go through them and make sure any that aren't covered get incorporated into our BAMSA conference in June. Just before we end, I'd like to invite all of the panel, as well as you, David, to give a final thought on something that struck you as interesting today, either for your current work or as an area that you think would be worth exploring more in future research. And for the participants, this is your final opportunity to put any last comments or any feedback for us into the chat. We will start with Miriam.
Hi, thank you. So I find that all very, very interesting. I think the thing that struck me most in reading your papers and listening to the conversation was picking up on something that you said earlier on, David, which was about the lack of looking at racialized and gendered aspects in the game. And that's something that I know that Sam and I are currently working on, which is the gendered aspects of the game. But I think the ideas of a racialized element to the game could be also potentially very interesting to think about a little bit further. So that's kind of where I'm taking it. So start looking at those kind of categories and concepts, those sociological things that we get excited by, and apply them and look at that, how they appear in the world of bridge would be what I would take from that. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Miriam. Zoe?
Thanks, Sam. I think for me, the thing that's, you know, particularly interesting, David, you spoke earlier about some of the kind of, I suppose, universal qualities of bridge that give it that sense that it can speak to people regardless of issues of race, gender, age, etc. But then, you know, we've talked quite a lot today about the diversity and the differentiation within different worlds of bridge and different geographic contexts. So I think it's quite interesting to think about how to unpack that and think globally about how to understand how bridge dynamics play out, but also to try and capture some of that sense in which there could be universal aspects, you know, that could be applied in that global sense.
Thanks, Zoe. Jordan?
Hi, David. Thank you very much for your feedback on the questions. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, and I think for moving forward with the BAMSA team, the particular area that I'm interested in from developing on from your work is exploring the types of players, but in a different context. So looking within the context of Scotland or looking within the context at an international geographic level. I think we've touched upon it today in terms of the online use of the online connections that we have now through these platforms, and by developing on from these and trying to engage with players across the world, I think it will open up avenues to further contextualize the different types of players, and I very much look forward to looking at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jordan. Christina?
Yes, my takeaway message was similar to Miriam's. I love the way, David, you described the game as exciting and fun, and that it transcends gender, ethnicity, income, age. I think that's just so true, and our challenge is how we communicate that and how we find the research to back that up. And your mention of role models, you're absolutely right. We need to find those role models that represent those neglected types of players that we're looking for. But a fascinating afternoon. Thank you.
And David, any final concluding thoughts from today?
Again, I would thank all of you for your interest and your participation. You've made me very happy about all this. But I would tell you, I think you guys are doing this absolutely right. When I started my doctoral research, I was happily oblivious about how to position this thing. I was interested in just trying to understand these social worlds and what they mean to people. And it became very apparent afterwards that I had to actually position my study, my research, my papers in ways that actually were important to what I would call leisure service organizations or providers. And so I didn't necessarily think about the benefits of bridge, the benefits of leisure in general. I took it for granted these things were important. And I think the more that you are able to position bridge as being good for people, not just bridges in maybe maintain an active mind across the lifespan, that's really important, but that there are other benefits as well for people in terms of community, perhaps social capital, civic engagement, maybe even breaking down barriers between groups that have historically been hostile. So I commend you and encourage you to really further our understanding of what bridge does for us collectively. So thank you.
And thank you. I mean, I'd like to just take this opportunity to thank all of the participants today. We've had some fantastic comments and questions coming in to the chat. Particular thanks to the panel speakers, and of course to you, David. You know, not only are we delighted to have finally met you, we've made you work hard today and you've lived up to our expectations. We really are keen to hear from all of you as participants, because this is our first event and we'd like to be able to improve this experience for our June conference. So any feedback from you would be much appreciated. Do please get in touch, email us, and we really hope to see many of you again in June. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
I will say goodbye.